If there was anything that was to open the eyes of African politicians, this is it. Today, if you have been victimized by COVID-19 and you are an African president, an African cabinet minister, an African bureaucrat, there are no planes to fly you to Europe and America. There are no planes to fly you to India. There are no planes to fly you to Dubai. You are with the rest of the Africans. And what is the lesson to be learned? The truth be told, Africa must not also wait to be a consumer of things that are made outside of Africa. Africans must be very reluctant to copy and paste some of the measures that are being taken in Europe and in the United States of America. If you permit me, for example, in the United States of America, where they have ordered lockdown in states such as New York and New Jersey, you will note that the federal government of the United States has injected $2 trillion United States dollars, which is just about the GDP of the entire Africa. Don't give more money to the military than you give to your health sector. Don't give money to the salaries of bureaucrats, but give more money to the health sector. In South Africa, we know that there is a lockdown. In Uganda, there has been a lockdown. In Rwanda, there is a lockdown. In Kenya, we have dusk to dawn curfews. In Tanzania, they have adopted a different approach, which is almost comparable to the approach that has been adopted in Sweden. But the very first thing that I want to say is we are dealing with something that even medical scientists have never encountered before. And therefore, every measure that is being taken is largely trial and error, although at the foundation of it, there is some science. It is therefore important that we obey the prescriptions relating to hygiene. This is something that has changed our lives fundamentally, and I hold the view that each country ought to be obedient to the foundational scientific prescriptions, but it is also important to recognize that each country must adopt measures that are sensitive to the realities in those countries, and I'm talking about the socio-economic realities. I know in many African cities, almost 70% of the population live on what I'll describe as a daily economy. These are men and women who leave their houses in the morning and earn money and buy foodstuffs for the day. And therefore, when we talk about lockdown, we ought to ask ourselves, how will we deal with this population? Are African governments prepared to provide food for this population? Are they prepared to pay rent for this population? Are they prepared to pay school fees for this population? And then there is the middle class, those who by dint of their lifestyle have acquired houses on mortgages or offices on mortgages, which are payable monthly. There is no domestic commerce. There is no international commerce. Are African governments going to ensure that there is a moratorium for the next 3 months so that no mortgages are paid? Are we talking about, if we talk about sectors of the economy, let me speak about the tourism industry. In Kenya, which is my mother country, almost 60 to 70% of hotels are now closed, which means that the workers have no meaningful engagement, which means that their incomes have gone down. That is true of Tanzania, that is true of Ghana, and I need not mention all these countries, so that the impact on the economy is of such a nature that Africans must be very reluctant to copy and paste some of the measures that are being taken in Europe and in the United States of America. If you permit me, for example, in the United States of America, where they have ordered lockdown in states such as New York and New Jersey, you will note that the federal government of the United States has injected $2 trillion United States dollars, which is just about the GDP of the entire Africa. In Germany, I think they may have put aside anything between 400 and 500 million euros. And many African countries are now going to the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and other multilateral lending institutions. So without belaboring the issue, my message to my fellow African is that this is not a death sentence. The COVID-19 is not a death sentence. Mm-hmm. It is an occasion for we as the Africans to reflect about our lives. It is an occasion for African countries to reflect how we run our economies. What portion of the budget do we give to our health sector? Do we give our military forces more money than we give to health? Do we give our public health sectors less money than we give to other non-productive sectors, which are merely in the arena of consumption? How do we deal with hygiene? Do we teach these basic things in schools? Do we have factories? We are now talking about masks, and we are waiting for Jack Ma from China to donate masks to us. And I thank Jack Ma. But have our bureaus of standardization determined that these masks meet certain thresholds? People are talking about testing vaccines, and we are very happy for the great scientific work that is going on in Europe and America, and I believe even underground in Africa. Is it not the occasion for African governments and African business people and African professionals to demand that in the area of research and development, we are always ahead of the game? So that there are many things that can be said, but I fear, without having the advantage of how inner governments work in Africa, that we may be copy-pasting practices that are being given pride of place in Europe and America without understanding the threat of social disorder that may be brought about by those who may say it'd rather contract coronavirus than die of starvation. And I've heard people saying that. We look at India. We have seen what has happened in India with the lockdown, and we have seen the commentary that is going around. Yeah. Permit me to say that I'm not pretending to be an expert. I'm not being prescriptive. I'm merely flagging out what I consider to be critical issues that ought to be taken into consideration by our governments. It is noteworthy that in many African countries, the brutality of the so-called disciplined forces has been manifested, which also calls into question, how do we train our men and women in uniform? Some have said cynically that a lot more people have died in Africa out of police brutality rather than out of coronavirus. The first thing that I must say is that the social media is now awash with information. And somebody has rightly said that part of the problem we have with this virus is what she has rightly described as infodemics, and in itself is a pandemic of too much information, most of which really are just rumors that are being given pride of place. But the truth be told, I've seen a conversation purportedly between two French doctors where they are saying that if there is a vaccine, then it ought to be tested in Africa. If it is true that they have said that, is something that we ought to condemn. But the truth be told, Africa must not also wait to be a consumer of things that are made outside of Africa. I know for a fact that under the aegis of the African Union, we have established 5 centers for disease control, located in East Africa, in Southern Africa, Central Africa, Northern Africa, and Western Africa. I know that there are universities and institutions that are involved in research in the area of public health. It is critical that at this stage, there ought to be a coordination of efforts so that African professionals in the area of research can also be thinking about a vaccine that would be utilized in the continent of Africa, a vaccine that will have been tested within the continent of Africa. And this is achievable. And permit me to say, this is where the diaspora can come in.
Yes.
Some of our best men and women live outside of the continent of Africa. Some of our best men and women in the area of medicine will be found in Europe. They'll be found in the United States of America. They'll be found in Australia. We must find a way where all these efforts are coordinated. And one can say that there are a number of ways of coordinating these efforts. Under SADC, I am quite certain that there is a mechanism that can bring together the professionals within SADC. The same can be done within the East African community, the same within Central Africa, West Africa, and the Maghreb. And under the umbrella of the African Union, these individuals can then be facilitated through serious funding for purposes of beginning to look at vaccines that will help us, not only because of COVID-19. In my view, COVID-19 is merely a wake-up call. I've been having a conversation just this evening with a friend of mine who is involved in the area of medical health, a lady called Tausi, who lives in the United States of America and is in Tanzania and is involved in the area of child survival, maternal health care, and that area. And people are doing great things in different parts of the world. Coordination. And the diaspora, and I belong to a number of groups that include men and women in the diaspora. The first question that we must ask, how can we coordinate this? I know in one group, a petition is already being signed for purposes of transmission to the chairman of the AU Council with a view to animating the African Union not to rest on her laurels, but to provide leadership and to convene African ministers for health. African ministers for health are now just in the business of reading daily the mortality and morbidity prevalence. We should do more than simply telling us the morbidity and mortality prevalence and go into the arena of dealing with real issues. We, as faithful citizens, are already obeying our governments. We are saying that whether our governments are in the direction of using excessive force or going overboard, fighting, as I've said at one forum, responding to a mosquito bite with a hammer, we are beginning to accept that. But we are saying, let us ask ourselves the question, COVID-19, like all other viruses, will not be totally eliminated.
Yes.
What will happen, and I speak not as an expert, what will happen is that it will plateau out, just in the same way that malaria is still with us, just in the same way that influenza is still with us, just in the same way that cholera is still with us. But we are saying that there are certain fundamental things that we must deal with. And these are basic hygiene. We must wash our hands. These are issues of the environment in which we live and operate, whether it's in the office space, whether it's in the domestic space, whether it's in the schools and colleges and health facilities. We must now improve. because we have been found stark naked. If you look at most African countries, they don't even have ICU beds. We don't have ventilators. Even the so-called large economies in Africa don't have more than 200 ICU beds. This is the situation in which we find ourselves. Should we lament now? Yes, we should lament, but use the lamentation as an avenue towards preparation. So that going forward, we must remember that if we operate regionally, and this is why I think it is very critical. Look at the East African region, and I'm going to give this region. This region puts together Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and South Sudan. We know that South Sudan, up till the 31st day of March, which is only 3 days ago, there was no case of corona. They had only tested 18. If they were to engage in robust testing, perhaps there would be people with symptoms. But if we were to coordinate regionally, perhaps we would help those who have the capacity to do so. Burundi also found herself in a similar situation. If we go down south, we know that the Zimbabwean economy has been battered by sanctions. We know that almost 70 to 80% of the Zimbabweans live out of employment and therefore live below $1 a day. If we are to go to West Africa, to countries such as Niger, Central African Republic, and we go to countries such as Mali and Mauritania, the situation is dire, the economic situation first. So my own view is the African Development Bank and other Pan-African institutions must now be in the lead. When we develop a vaccine, how do we test them? Because we live in a continent where when the Federal Drug Administration Authority in the United States has tested a vaccine, then Africa assumes that that is fine. If the Europeans have tested a vaccine, then we think it is fine. When the Chinese have tested one, we think it is fine. Why can't we, during this period, begin to see the political class empowering the scientist class with a view to ensuring that we move into the direction of discovery? Our universities should be empowered, our institutions. So I've spoken about that, and I'm saying our standardization should be homegrown. That does not mean and cannot mean that we shall not collaborate with others. But as Ali Mazrui once said, we cannot be a continent which is in the business of consuming what it does not produce and consuming what it does not produce. And secondly, on the economic front, we've got to look at our feeble economies. I've already talked about some of the countries that rely on tourism. Tourism is dead for the next 2 years, even more. You look at the aviation sector, all the airlines and most African airlines really were suffering except the Ethiopian airline. And if you look at, you go beyond that sector, you go into the flower sector, you go into mining sector. All these sectors are affected in a very fundamental way. And that brings me to the question of lockdown.
Yes.
Perhaps the word lockdown is the word that is confusing us because it's also a foreign word. Lockdown, as we understand it and as we have seen it deployed in Wuhan, in China, and as being deployed in Uganda and in South Africa, means, number one, that you will be confined to your house, you will remain there, and those who are confining you to your house assume, among other things, that you'll have stocked on food, that you have refrigerator, that you have a microwave, and that you have all these provisions, and you'll be able to ride the lockdown. How many Africans have refrigerators?
Yeah.
How many Africans have microwaves? How many Africans can afford to stock on food? Those who go to construction sites and are paid $1 on that day and they use half of it for consumption, are our governments ready to cater for them. And I'm not minimizing the impact of this unknown virus. I'm simply saying, before you order lockdown, think through it. Work with the neighborhood associations. Ensure that your supermarkets can work. I hear some of our government officials across Africa say that you can order food, that it will be delivered to your doorsteps. If you are in an informal system in Makoko, in Lagos, in Nigeria, how do you order food to be brought to which house, which is floating in Makoko?
Really?
So these are the critical issues that I think ought to be brought to bear. And the third thing is, when you deploy police officers, when you deploy the armed forces, they ought to be told that the country is not at war with the citizenry. And therefore, it does not require them to use the force to put down the citizenry. But the other thing that I see in many African countries, just to ride on the crest of that question, is the assumption by many African politicians, when you hear them talk, is as if the country is the capital city. So that when you hear many African countries, they speak as if you are talking about Mali, it is in Bamako. If you are talking about South Africa, is in Johannesburg, or if you are talking about Zimbabwe, is in Harare. The truth is that the bulk of Africans still live in rural Africa.
That's true.
And therefore, when you talk about lockdown, you also have to ask yourself, or you have these measures, you've got to ask yourselves how you are dealing with the different publics. If you look at the United States of America, for example, the reaction of the United States of America federal government to New York is not necessarily their reaction in Oklahoma or in some other state like Washington or Idaho. So too in African countries, in Nigeria, when we are dealing with the federal capital in Abuja or in Lagos or in Ogun State, or in Delta State, or in Katsina, or Zamfara, or in any other, or any one of those, we've got to ask ourselves what the situation is. We must also not forget that there are places in Africa where there is conflict. If you look at southern Cameroon, which is in conflict, and therefore the ground is destabilized, how are we going to deal with the situation in southern Cameroon or in Amazonia? How are we dealing with Central African Republic? How are we dealing with the situation in Eastern Congo? How are we dealing with the situation in Northern Burkina Faso, in the Sahelian region? How are we dealing with the situation in Libya? All these are silent events. And I don't hear, perhaps they are saying it, but I'm sufficiently keen to have known, but I'm not hearing the voice of the African Union. I'm not hearing the voice of SADC. I know that President Cyril Ramaphosa, who is the current chair of the African Union, did hold a meeting of his bureau and issued a statement. But the statement did not have teeth. It did not have fire. It did not deal with the mundane issues. That is what I want to hear from my leaders, because we are at war with an enemy which is invisible, and we must be on a war footing, but it's a different kind of war. That war and that enemy will not be shot down with bullets. It will be shot down with ideas. It will be shot down when the government accepts that it has no monopoly of ideas or wisdom, and that you need to recruit people in different sectors. I've already, at the risk of repeating myself, ask those now non-governmental organizations that are active in the medical sector, the universities, the research institutions, the business community. A good warrior, a good war general fights a war, but also thinks of the post-war environment. If there was anything that was to open the eyes of African politicians, this is it. Today, if you have been victimized by COVID-19 and you are an African president, an African cabinet minister, an African bureaucrat, there are no planes to fly you to Europe and America. There are no planes to fly you to India. There are no planes to fly you to Dubai. You are with the rest of the Africans. And what is the lesson to be learned? Don't give more money to the military than you give to your health sector. Don't give money to the salaries of bureaucrats, but give more money to the health sector. Remember that research and development is at the heart of the development of any nation. Remember that manufacturing is also critical. We must be a nation that is capable of nations that can have their state-of-the-art hospitals, nations that can research in the area of medicine and have pharmaceutical companies, nations that are capable of supplying their own people with medical equipment and supplies. That is the nation, and those are the nations that we desire. And I pray and hope that post-corona, our leaders will not suffer from selective amnesia and begin to behave as if there was no corona. They must now take a solemn vow that when this corona is controlled and tamed, our urgent business will be to improve our health sector. Our urgent business will be to ensure that we give sufficient funds to research and development. Our urgent business will be to ensure that our men and women who are in the medical profession are compensated more than we compensate our politicians. Yes. I look forward to those days. I look forward to the opening of minds. I pray that those of you who are in the diaspora look to the continent. You may remain where you are, but coordinate and help your motherland.